All right, welcome back to week 8, where we will be discussing chapter 12 in your textbook, which speaks to providing human services for folks who live in rural communities. You may have noticed on the original version of the syllabus that this week was also supposed to cover substance use. However, I have realized that that is just way too much material. You will see at least one article and one video, as well as some book recommendations embedded in this article that sort of speak to substance use in the context of this larger topic. But none of the questions on any future quizzes will be related to those pieces of material. Any substance use that you're quizzed on or expect to know about for uh, assignments in this class would be purely based on the textbook. It just felt like too much to cover both of these topics, especially this late in the quarter when I know you have a lot due next week. So we're going to try to just have this be a slightly lower level of work week. In that same vein, I'm also going to keep this micro lecture very short. I don't have a lot of personal insight to add to the material. I haven't worked in rural communities before. I have a couple thoughts that I'll just share briefly based on my own review of the text, but I will mostly just let the materials speak for themselves. The biggest thing that came up for me when I was looking through the textbook and the materials contained in this module is just this idea of access. I think it's really important to recognize that when we're thinking about an urban setting, I'm going to use Seattle as an example here. Even if someone has a lot of things going on, a lot of stuff they might want support around, even if their barriers to accessing these resources are really high, it is likely that there is still a resource somewhat near them that can theoretically provide support. Of course, there are also lots of people fighting for those same resources, right? We know that housing programs are really overwhelmed and there are wait lists to see counselors and things like that, which is all its own very real issue. It is worth pointing out that the resources at least exist and are in the general vicinity. When we think about access in rural communities, I'm thinking about a few specific things. I think about transportation. Rural communities are less likely to have robust public transportation systems, so it's less likely that if someone doesn't have a car or can't afford gas, it's less likely they'll be able to physically get to a resource in the first place, even if it is maybe just in the next town over. I'm thinking about access in terms of the number of options available. It is not far-fetched to think that there might be one clinic that supports several smaller towns or several smaller communities, that there might be a really long waiting list to see a provider. That clinic may or may not have additional services embedded in it. Hopefully it would, knowing that it's serving a larger number of smaller communities, but it's not a guarantee that there would be a mental health professional embedded, a case manager, someone who can help get you set up with Medicaid. And so access both to kind of physical brick and mortar services, access to the auxiliary things like transportation that we need to access these resources. And then the third tenet that I view as being sort of an access issue is even just the access to awareness of these resources in the first place. If you're living in Seattle, for example, and let's say maybe you're unhoused, you live downtown, or you sleep where you can, even if you're not aware of the breadth of resources available to you, it's not unlikely that you've walked by the downtown emergency service center, or that maybe you go in to use like a cooling center at a library and there's a table there set up by DSHS. And it's just more likely that you're going to interact with these resources sort of without trying to. In smaller communities that are farther away from these resources, it's completely understandable that you've maybe never even heard of DSHS, that you've maybe never thought to apply for food stamps, and even if you did, maybe you live in a food desert and there's nowhere in the area that would take an EBT card. So we have a lot of really, I think, understandable reasons that people might not be engaging with resources. And then another thing that the text points out that I think is really important is kind of this idea of outside forces coming in and trying to sort of impose their own ideas and their own fixes on these communities without taking all of this stuff into account, without taking cultural norms of a given community into account. You know, when we look at the communities highlighted in the textbook, it's not just one kind of rural community. There's a lot in here. There are reservations where indigenous folks are living. There are impoverished areas where most people are middle-aged and white. There's impoverished areas where, you know, most people are Black or Hispanic. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer to solving any of these problems. And then there's also likely going to be a lot missing from someone coming in outside of that community and trying to impose solutions that are not rooted in the realities of that individual community. And I think that's really important to think about. I included a video in here about the opioid epidemic in a town in West Virginia. And there's one moment in the video where you hear a first responder talking about how continuing to throw resources at this problem feels like a waste. It feels like a waste of resources. And, you know, that people don't want to help. They don't want to engage in these resources. And I think while I can absolutely understand where this guy is coming from, if you watch the video, you'll kind of, I think, understand where he's coming from as well. I think it's also really important to recognize that people may not on the surface want to engage with a resource because they might not trust you if you are from outside of this community, if you are coming in and trying to impose ideas that are unfamiliar and don't make sense. And they also are, especially in the case of substance use, right? It's not just about what people want. It's about what they know. It's about what is reasonable for them given their circumstances. And just shoving a resource in someone's face and expecting them to accept it isn't realistic in any setting, but I think in this setting we've got some factors playing in together that make that extra unlikely to work just because someone wants it to. So that is all I'm going to say for today. I think there's this is a pretty short chapter, and I think there is a lot here. And so I hope folks will just kind of take what feels helpful and extrapolate on their own. Please feel free to include things that you wished we learned more about in this chapter in the discussion board, factors that really caught your eye. And then if there are any questions about substance use, kind of knowing that we didn't get to it, please feel free to let me know in your discussion board posts. I can always try to include some resources in the last module for the quarter if that's an area where folks really would have liked to spend more time. Just please let me know. I will let you get back to the material and see you in the next one.